everybody. Welcome back to the Development of Ancient Cities. This is the third lecture of the course. Last time we talked about archaeological methods and theories. And today we are actually getting into some real archaeology. And rather than jumping in to early things that people have called cities, although we will look at some things that do get called cities pretty quickly, um, instead, we are starting with the whole problem of settled life. Um, why do humans want to live in groups? Why do we want to crowd ourselves together? Um, and as usual, I have some of the big questions that we'll address in today's lecture, written up here at the front of the PowerPoint for you guys, just to sort of orient you into the guiding questions of the lecture. Um, we will address those two questions. Why do we want to live in dense groups? Why do people, live together at all? Um, what were some of the ways that humans changed from loose bands to more settled ways of life? We'll look into the material culture of this. We'll also take a look at the bioanthropology and some of the changes in climate that are related to these major and fundamental changes in human society that happened in the last, 20,000 years or so. We'll talk about this thing called the Neolithic Revolution, and we'll start grappling with the emergence of social complexity. Social complexity being a way of living together that involves visible differences in rank and wealth. Social complexity involves things that we can call governments, things that we can call organized religion. So these are some of the important realms of inquiry for this lecture. And rather than starting at the beginning of the Neolithic, we really need to back things up a bit to a transformation in human cognition that we can see even earlier, in the late Paleolithic period in Europe. So as usual, because these slides are very dense and I want you to pay attention to the images and the text, I've turned my camera off for the rest of the lecture. So, during the last ice age, somewhere in between 50 and 30,000 years before the present, you will see this abbreviation, KYBP, 1,000 years before present. We start to see changes in the ways that humans had been living, and in the things that they had been making, which had stayed surprisingly similar for well over 100,000 years before this time. The reasons for this are not entirely settled, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 30,000 years ago, depending on where you look around the world, we see a surprising and sudden explosion of art. We start to see caves painted with, complicated, overlapping images of the important animals that lived around people at the edges of the great glaciers that covered the northern part of the world at this time. We start to see the beginnings of three-dimensional sculpture, such as the very famous Venus of Willendorf here, carved of ivory. And we start to see other things that we really only catch through glimpses and proxies. Things like fabulously embellished clothing, that could be covered in thousands of tiny ivory beads. Something is different in this period. This is not a class about the Paleolithic, but I want to start us out here because too long after this, in the grand scheme of things, we start to see really clear beginnings of what can, be thought of as architecture. And as you will find, architecture plays a large part in this class. So, scholars of the Paleolithic period generally see about two distinct human cultural groups in what is southern and central Europe during the last glacial maximum. You'll hear this term again a lot in the next, in the rest of this lecture. The last glacial maximum between about 20,000 and 15,000 years before the present. Was the period of the greatest southern advance of the Arctic glaciers, and also of the smaller glaciated areas of mountain ranges that are today, well, except for the Alps, not permanently covered in ice packs. And it's during this period in what we would today call, southwestern Russia and the Ukraine and the Czech Republic, in this area at the northern edge of what was a vast steppe, not a heavily forested area like much of Europe is today, but a vast grassland at the edge of the cold edge of the glacier. We start to see humans coming together and building semi-permanent structures. Now, earlier we've seen plenty of evidence of sheltering in caves, but this is places where humans have created their own shelter in using one of the most plentiful resources of that area that had very little in the way of tree cover, it seems at the time. They used bone, and particularly in these cases we're going to look at for the next few minutes, they used mammoth bones. Mammoths, you can see a recent sculpture of one just outside the Natural History Building here on campus. Were the large relatives of elephants that were well adapted to the cold environment of the steppe land at the edge of the ancient glaciers during the last ice age. And the inhabitants of the human inhabitants of that area made use of mammoth bones, both for small mobile pieces of material culture, but also to create shelter for themselves. This is one reconstructed in a museum in the Ukraine, and here on the right is an archaeological site with the remains of a very large, very early mammoth bone shelter in what is today Western Russia. The earliest versions of these structures, like the one at Kostensky in Russia, were built, standing alone, and were quite large, multiple meters across. They could have fit probably several dozen people, 2 to 4 dozen people could have lived here. Later structures were generally built smaller, which may have something to do with the availability of mammoth bone, may have something to do with changes in the culture in any particular group at any particular time. But both the larger, earlier mammoth structures and the smaller, slightly later ones seem to be seasonal habitation centers. So we have people coming together in groups to do this important task of not just hunting mammoths, but also processing them. The thousands and thousands of pounds of meat and hide and other useful anatomical bits that these, large animals would provide required large cooperative workforces at particular parts of the year. So this is a reconstruction of a village that was likely inhabited year-round, created from these mammoth bone huts at a site in the modern Czech Republic called Dolní Věstonice. This is somewhere in that neighborhood of 25 to 20,000 years ago. And unlike the larger, earlier structures out on the steppes in Western Russia, this was likely inhabited year-round. Dolní Věstonice is an extremely interesting archaeological site, not only because of these mammoth bone huts, but because this is also one of the first places where humans started to experiment with one of the most important materials of the ancient world, fired clay. Now, this is not quite ceramic yet. There are important structural changes that happen in clay when it is fired past a certain point that changes the actual structure of the material and binds together silica atoms in the clay itself. However, before that point, people at Dolní Věstonice, probably about 25,000 BC, were using fired clay to create sculptures like this. This is the so-called Venus of Dolní Věstonice. These small, extremely curvy female sculptures that really exaggerate the female secondary sexual characteristics that indicate fertility. Things like, large breasts, large padded hips and buttocks and bellies. These are one of the most talked about and most widely found types of material culture from the Paleolithic. And although most of these sculptures in other places are made out of other kinds of materials like ivory or stone, wood, unfortunately, in archaeological contexts, often does not survive very well, so they may have also been made of wood. Here at Dolní Věstonice, we find several examples of them made in fired clay. We also find other kinds of fired clay artifacts. In fact, over 2,300 fragments of sculptures and fired clay pellets were excavated at this site. They include lots of small animal figures. They include several of these these exaggerated female figures. They also include these pellets, some of which both the figurines and the just rounded balls of clay that seem to not have been intended to look like anything in the real world. Some of these seem to have been made deliberately to explode. And this is really interesting in the whole history of the development of ceramics, because this is a suggestion that some of this may have had to do with ritual. If you trap air bubbles in clay, you can in fact make a wet piece of clay explode when it gets fired, when that air expands quickly. This can be accidental, and it can actually be very dangerous. You can cause a truly disastrous explosion that can hurt lots of people. Or if you do it small enough, you can just make something that is essentially the Paleolithic version of a firecracker. It's called a popper. It will just, make a nice bang in a fire. So, this may be, a sign of some sort of, ritual transformation um, involving, the elements of the world. I don't want to speculate too far because this could get very woo very fast. But it's worth, noting that, this kind of daring experimentation, well, it's not impossible to do um, when you are not grouped together with other human beings. It's much more likely when humans come together in groups and, you know, make meaning together. This we'll see in, the coming lectures, is a key part of what makes cities. It's not just architecture, it's not just agriculture, it's not just logistics. It's also this shared meaning and the radical amplification of some of the most creative parts of humanity when you start to put a lot of people together to share ideas. Let's leave the realm of the woo and get back to something a little more tangible. Um, Bioarchaeologists who are interested in human skeletal materials and the physical history of human beings have shown us that Paleolithic populations were actually really quite healthy. Um, they seem to have had excellent nutrition in general. People were generally relatively tall, had good teeth without a ton of dental problems. Um, their long bones, the arms and legs show good nutrition, plentiful exercise, um, all of these physical signs of health. And we don't see a ton of disease. Um, the many of the major diseases that have plagued humanity over the last 10 to 12 to 10,000 years um, are born out of crowding and poor sanitation and the effects of humanity on the environment. When you can move around quite a bit and you have, less competition for food, and you don't have human debris and filth building up in a specific place, you're not going to see a lot of those diseases. Um, Instead, what we see is a lot of stress from a nomadic lifestyle, um, lots of physical injuries. It was not a safe or easy life. We see stresses from the climate. It was very cold. Um, and we see lots of dangers of pregnancy and childbirth, and also physical violence, but either between individuals or, getting trampled by, large aurochs, wild bison, and um, ancient relatives of modern cattle. In general, we see women having a lower life expectancy than men in the Paleolithic. We see women living an average of 30 years as compared to men's average of 35. And I do need to stress that this is an average. Um, Child and infant mortality would have still been relatively high. And, people live so this is averaged, including in many cases people who did not live out of childhood. So keep that in mind when you hear about how short lifespans in the ancient world were. But that said, some people did live into at least their 60s or older. And these include not just people who were very lucky to have enjoyed, perfect health throughout their long lives. We also see many indications of people being cared for in spite of disability and in spite of, loss of limbs and traumatic brain injuries and other such things. So we do see people living well into their 60s or older. Oh, I'm sorry, for women, this lower life expectancy was probably a combination of the dangers of pregnancy and childbirth combined with the stresses from a nomadic lifestyle that would have exacerbated some of these issues. So, how do we tell what the climate was like 25 or more thousand years ago? There are multiple ways. These ways is through the dating of speleothems. These are the stalactites and stalagmites that are found in caves, particularly limestone caves, and the minerals that precipitate out of the water that is slowly filters into caves um, fluctuates. The amount of minerals that cling to these formations as the water filters into the cave and drips off of them. Um, this fluctuates based on precipitation patterns in the above ground world, um, and so we can geologists can in fact date this mineral formation using physical science, thermal ionization mass spectrometry in this case, and looking at the ratios of different kinds of oxygen isotopes that were used, or ratios of oxygen isotopes in these minerals, which collect essentially in the same pattern as they form rings. It's like tree rings, but in stone. Um, and then by looking at the differences in the change of C13 and the change in oxygen 18, here this delta 13C, delta 18O, scientists can then reconstruct precipitation patterns. So this is what it looks like when you start looking at these rings of precipitated minerals in stalactites and stalagmites. Um, so during the last glacial maximum, roughly 18,000 years ago, let's go for a round number, this period was characterized by sudden cooling in northern Europe. The ice sheets that ranged from the Arctic all the way down into what is today Central Europe and into um, places in North America, ice sheets coming up from the South Pole also. Since we're focused on the greater Mediterranean, we're looking at the Northern European ice sheet in this case. During this period, even though there was less overall rainfall, um, there was also less evaporation. This means that there was actually quite a bit of surface water across Africa and the Near East, leading to things like the fact that the Sahara Desert was much, 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 much smaller than it is today. And instead, what you had in Central and Northern Africa was a vast grassland. So, after about 15,000 years ago, between 15,000 and 8,000 years ago, we see this rapid transition called the Holocene climate transition, wherein climate rose dramatically. Um, so 7 degrees, an average of 7 degrees centigrade over the course of you know decades rather than millennia, which is what this is counted in. Um, this marked a period of melting ice sheets, which increased both average temperature and precipitation. So we have for the area that we are interested in over the course of this class, the ancient Near East, we have high lake levels, lots of surface water, rich soil because of rich plant growth. And after this first peak, there were three distinct episodes of global cooling and aridification. That means getting drier. So we have this bumpy graph. This is all based on temperature temperatures recorded in the ice sheets of Greenland. This is done through kinds of isotopic analysis, looking at the, again, delta 13C, and comparing the ratio of two of the stable isotopes of carbon, C13 and C12. We'll hear about C14, which is not stable, in a bit, and looking at those in the atmosphere in parts per thousand. So this type of isotopic analysis uses specialized forms of mass spectrometry, and similar kinds of analysis are really good for some of the things we'll look at shortly, like studying diet and analyzing organic residues found on objects. So back to the climate. We have a peak, we have melting glaciers, and after a certain point, those glaciers just cannot sustain themselves. So even though over the course of about 6,000 years, the temperature dropped again, we actually see, coming out of the trough of a period called the Younger Dryas, which is about a millennium and a half of return to the cold and dry conditions of the Paleolithic, we see again this dramatic rise in temperature and precipitation that we can see in Greenland. This marks the end of the Paleolithic period and the beginning, after the glaciers had significantly retreated out of northern Europe, we see a transition to a phase of human life called the Mesolithic. So the Mesolithic is a fascinating period. And although there is not farming yet, we will get to farming in the Neolithic. That is essentially the Neolithic Revolution. This period between the end of the Ice Age and the widespread adoption of farming is fascinating in the ways that people adapted to this newly lush, rich landscape, both in the ancient Near East, which we'll look at in just a minute, but also in Northern Europe. And I want to talk just briefly about Northern Europe because this is just plain fascinating. And what we see, both in the ancient Near East and in Northern Europe, is not farming so much as nurturing of landscapes. So we'll talk about some of those things in the Fertile Crescent that lead pretty directly to agriculture. But in Northern Europe, what we see is a reliance on the common European hazel tree as kind of a backbone of human society in the northern parts of Europe. And we see so through analysis of historical pollen levels, we see an explosion of the growth of hazel trees. For those who are not familiar, you may be familiar with the nuts. Hazelnuts are the main flavoring ingredient of Nutella. You find them today mostly in different kinds of candy. If you like Bacci, the little Italian hazelnut and chocolate candies, those are hazelnuts. can go to Starbucks and get a hazelnut latte, and you will, get the highly sweetened version of this, distinctive kind of seed. After the retreat of the glaciers, pollen analysis showed just a massive boom over the course of barely 1,000 years that followed the retreat of those glaciers. Now, it is not certain whether this was just an aggressive and opportunistic woodland edge plant, the hazel tree, taking advantage of newly opened space, or if humans may have helped it along. Because the hazel tree and its nut and its wood were some of the mainstays of society at this time. Furthermore, large parts of what is today the North Sea between the now island of Britain and the now mainland of Europe was actually above water. This is an area called Doggerland. Um, and, this is only just beginning to be known through a variety of remote sensing techniques used to explore the seabeds, the seafloor, and, other archaeological techniques, some of which just involve pulling stuff up with fishing nets, but many of which, in some of the shallower areas off the coasts of Europe, involve actual underwater excavations of Mesolithic coastal settlements. And it seems that large parts of this now lost landscape were extensive wetlands and incredibly rich. There were forest resources, deer, wild boar, berries, hazel, hundreds of plants that were not necessarily cultivated per se, but nurtured in the environment by humans. People have always affected their landscapes that they live in, and the Mesolithic is no different. And so this was a culture of hunting and gathering, but gathering that did involve a great deal of selection and nurturing and shaping of the environment. This is a headdress made from the skull of a type of deer that lived in northern Europe and now mostly lives in the northern parts of Britain, called red deer. Although most of these have been found at a specific site in Britain called Star Carr, that is up here in what is today Yorkshire and would have been near the coast of Doggerland. Similar types of headdresses have actually been found in over 10 sites across northern Europe. So this is a fascinating place, and we see some of the same uses of the landscape, comparable uses of the landscape in the wetlands in what is southern Mesopotamia. So I'll talk more about this. This is the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where some of those first cities of the ancient world came into being. So let's step back from northern Europe and look again at some biological anthropology. So broadly speaking, the diet of people in the Mesolithic was relatively similar to that of the Upper Paleolithic. There was the massive megafauna, like mammoths, of the Paleolithic had largely gone extinct or retreated into subglacial areas much farther to the north. But humans were still relying on, both meat and foraged, their foraged vegetable foods. Oh, there's a better word for that. Sorry, guys. Um, nuts, fruits, leaves, seeds. Um, those things that are not meat and fish. Um, so, and the health levels do show, similarities. However, we also start to see some fluctuations and some stresses, some diseases and environmental stresses that show that this was not some sort of wetland Eden, like the rather poetic description on the previous slide may have indicated. We do start to see some environmental diseases like malaria in humans at this point, and also uh, parasites like hookworm. This is a hookworm. They're microscopic, but they're nasty critters, can make you real sick. That really thrive in environments where humans are starting to live together more densely. So parasites, alas, come with other people. Um, we also see Mesolithic populations becoming more violent. This may again have to do with increased population density. It may have to do with um, some of the abrupt changes in climate and availability of resources. Um, it's again, we will find that many things are in this class are not the sort of history set in stone that you may think of what we know about the ancient world. Gradually, over the course of the Mesolithic, especially in the Near East, which we will focus on more um, intensely um, starting very soon, we see that there is a that people are starting to settle down. They're starting to spend more time in one place and starting to very often live together in larger groups. The hookworm is the negative side of that. Um, but there were also a lot of positives. It seems that gradual sedentism is the habit of staying in one place, not being nomadic. It seems that this promoted female health by decreasing the stress on women during and immediately after pregnancy. You get more rest. You get to heal up from giving birth more thoroughly before you move on to the next, you know, large animal herd or the next, really good place to harvest, specific kinds of produce. As I've mentioned before, one of the most important ways that um, we think about understanding changes in the ancient world is through periods. These are ultimately kind of arbitrary, although not completely. And for the very early ancient world, these are not what we would call historical periods. They are based instead on changes that we can see in kinds of technology, in how people are living, what kinds of structures are they living in, what can we see about how societies have organized themselves. Um, so we are transitioning here out of the Mesolithic and into the Neolithic, the new Stone Age. Paleolithic is paleo old, lithos stone. They're using bits and pieces of Greek to make new words. Meso, middle lithic Stone Age. And finally, Neolithic, new Stone Age. This is the period that is closest to us in time. Um, and in the Neolithic period, we see some changes in technology. polished stone tools. We see this is the period when people begin to domesticate plants and animals. Um, we start to see permanent settlements of various sizes. So again, the first things we call cities begin in the Neolithic. And sometimes we see um, more complex forms of society. And these are going to be the topics that I lecture about for the rest of the class. So where do we get this idea of the Neolithic? The important archaeologists that I mentioned in the previous lecture, this guy, Vere Gordon Childe, who worked in the first half of the 20th century, um, and who is sometimes called the Great Synthesizer, um, is one of the first people to really start to, um, one, look at this transition to settled life and farming and urban living um, around the world. In fact, that is why he's called, this question is what led him to become the Great Synthesizer. Um, and he is also the one who started using the term the Neolithic Revolution. Um, and we're going to spend the next section of the lecture looking at what this Neolithic Revolution was. So, as I mentioned earlier in the course, agriculture has developed multiple times across um, around the world. We seem it we will be spending most of our time looking at this sort of epicenter of the development of agriculture um, in what is sometimes called the Fertile Crescent, the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what are today the many countries of the Near East. But just as a quick reminder, this is not the only place that developed agriculture. Several places in the Americas developed different kinds of agriculture that spread in different ways throughout those continents. It developed independently in China based on rice and millet, in the New Guinea highlands of Papua New Guinea, and we don't know exactly where in sub-Saharan Africa, but somewhere in the temperate zone of sub-Saharan Africa, all forms of farming also developed. So this is not a, purely Mediterranean phenomenon in any way, shape, or form. It is simply the one we're going to focus on in this class. The next several lectures, I will be referencing quite a few people, places, and cultures. I have tried to lay out some of these in this chart. Um, don't worry too much at the moment if don't know what the heck most of these things are. We're going to get to it. I'm just trying to put it all in one place so that you have kind of a bit of a timeline, have a bit of a reference for if I talk about the Jemdet Nasser period, you can quickly look back like, okay, we're talking about Mesopotamia, not the east coast of the Mediterranean, which is the Levant, or the area that is today most of Turkey, which is called Anatolia. So this slide is for your reference. Do not worry if you don't understand all of this immediately. So the late Neolithic and early Mesolithic culture of the Levant. So we'll call, just to set some guidelines here at the beginning, I will generally call areas on the east coast of the Mediterranean and in the near interior of the east coast of the Mediterranean the Levant. This includes modern parts of modern Syria, modern Jordan, modern Turkey, modern Israel and Palestine, and parts of modern Egypt. Um, we're not going to get into political divisions, either historical or modern. I'm just going to call it the Levant. Um, so, the late Paleolithic culture and early Mesolithic culture of the Levant is generally referred to as the Kabaran culture. They were hunter-gatherers. They seem to have they are the people who first made really extensive use of wild cereals and wild grasses that were native to the Levant and further to the east in the northern parts of what is called the Fertile Crescent, or the northern parts of Mesopotamia. We see them using some of the characteristic technologies of that developed in and around the Mesolithic, especially the use of what are called microliths. Again, Greek roots put together by modern scholars to make new words. Micro meaning tiny. Again, lithos, like Paleolithic and Mesolithic. Lithos, the word for stone, which refers to, rather than using one big chunk of stone and whacking it down into a single sharp-edged tool, microliths are tiny sharp flakes of stone that are flaked off of a larger core, and which can then be either used by themselves or set into composite tools. So here we have a microlithic flint knife. So each of these individual little flakes of stone would be very sharp, and it's set into a wooden handle that makes it easier to hold, less likely to cut yourself, and it makes it possible, in theory, to replace these. Think about if you shave, think about, your razor at home with, which may perhaps have replaceable blade cartridges, or even if you're very old school and use straight razor, replaceable blades. We see the members of the Kabarian culture, engraving stone plaques with, things like this vulture or raven here. And we also see them making early uses of tools that are especially useful for grinding and cracking grain, which is the seeds of, cereals and grasses. So things like this stone mortar and pestle, which is a very early instance of ground stone tools. So rather than flaking stone tools, these have actually been ground into shape with abrasives. So starting around 10,000 BC, in this wider area, so we have the Levant here, we have Egypt and the Nile River Valley here, and then we have this wide arc that runs from southern Anatolia, that runs through the Levant into southern Anatolia, and then into the area between these two major rivers, the Euphrates River to the west and the Tigris River to the east, that drain the large mountain ranges of southern Anatolia, and here the Caucasus and the Zagros in the northern parts of what are today Iraq and Iran. These two large rivers carry water down to the Persian Gulf, and we'll talk quite a bit about the Persian Gulf, but they create this system of interlocking and branching rivers that bring water and fresh soil into this particular area. So the Neolithic, starting around 10,000 BC, in this broad area, we start to see the beginnings of a transition from hunting and gathering to things that we can identify as agriculture and animal husbandry. Um, we start to see that so far, some of this earliest evidence comes from two particular places where human beings settled down permanently, not on a seasonal basis, but permanently. Um, one of these is two of these are in the Levant. One of them is Jericho, and another one is called Ain Ghazal. We will look at these in more detail. And in Anatolia, on the other side of these mountains, at a place called Çatalhöyük, another place that we will look at in much greater detail as we go ahead. So these are people who adopted a sedentary lifestyle. However, many places throughout the greater Fertile Crescent at the same time that some groups of people were settling down um, and starting to deliberately cultivate specific um, planted animal crops. People were still living around them, living hunter gatherer type lives, and some of them never settled down, although they did adopt animal husbandry. And so throughout this period, and still today, we have people who are pastoral nomads who move their flocks and herds from place to place rather than living a sedentary life. So this is the basics of the Neolithic Revolution. Now, this is not a revolution because it is quick. It is a revolution because it is such a dramatic change. This is a revolution that involves fits and starts. It involves people starting things that look like farming and giving them up. It involves people doing what some scholars have called play farming. They might cultivate some things when it's easy. They might hunt, they might gather when it's, when conditions are better for that. Hunting is seen right through this period of certain species is seen right through this period alongside deliberately cultivating and eventually domesticating certain kinds of animals. And this is all taking place in an extremely ecologically diverse environment. The landscape of the Fertile Crescent includes everything from extremely dry desert to extremely lush wetland down here at the Persian Gulf. It includes important rivers multiple important rivers, Tigris and Euphrates river system up here, and also the Nile river system over in Egypt, which act in very different ways, and which mean that agriculture develops in different ways in these two important areas. So this is a very ecologically and environmentally complicated area, an environmentally and ecologically rich area, and provides lots of opportunities for human beings to engage with plant and animal species and to move them around. And that's where we're going in the next slide. So even though most of the focus on the development of agriculture in the Neolithic is on plants, livestock, animal husbandry also plays an incredibly important part in the Neolithic transition. So the first animal that we are sure was domesticated is the dog. And that is, dogs are far, far older companions of humans than any other domesticated animal. At the moment, some of the best early evidence points to dogs becoming companions to humans around 30,000 years before the present, many times further into the human past than any other domesticated animal. Most of the rest of domesticated animals were developed during the Neolithic Revolution. Um, After dogs, it seems that um, the next wave of domestication um, come from come with sheep and goats. Um, these are sheep are originally from the Zagros Mountains in what is over here, what is today the northern part of Iraq and Iran. Um, Goats are native to everywhere in the Fertile Crescent. Um, and both of these animals are herd animals. Um, and that natural tendency to live in groups. Dogs, domesticated from wolves, of course, um, live, wolves live in packs. They have close social and emotional bonds and family structures. Sheep and goats live in herds led by rams. Cattle, also herd animals, um, originally from the Taurus Mountains in Anatolia, although the precursors of cattle, the aurochs, were found widely across Afro-Eurasia. And finally, of the sort of agricultural domesticates in um, the greater Mediterranean area, we have pigs. Pigs are ornerier than sheep, goats, or cattle. Even today, domesticated pigs can be very dangerous creatures. Um, Interestingly, in all cases with domestication, we see that animals get smaller at first. It makes them easier to handle. It makes them easier to keep in company with people. Um, we also see other changes. Bone structures get lighter. Um, Mutations that wouldn't otherwise necessarily enable an animal to survive in the wild. Weird mutations of coloring or coat type or size or shape can be nurtured and in many cases found useful or at very least interesting to humans. And we'll see some of the outcomes of those things in the near future. Cats are a very interesting case. Um, Cats seem to have um, become close companions to humans at around the same time or slightly later than the other Neolithic domesticates. But it seems that cat domestication was as much a collaborative process as anything um, directed by humans. Essentially, with cats, humans storing large amounts of grain attracted the major prey animals of cats, who do not necessarily need to live in groups the way um, canines or sheep or goats or cattle do. However, if resources are abundant, the Middle Eastern and African um, subspecies of Felis sylvestris, the wild cat, are happy to live in colonies. Humans increasingly using and storing large amounts of grain attracts rodents and lizards and bugs and small reptiles, all of which are wonderful prey for Felis sylvestris. Um, so we created the conditions that cats like. We attract their prey. Cats who in abundance will, happily will share food and space and, create family-based colony populations, um, you know, at first at least tolerated the presence of humans because, we have good food for them. Early farmers got good pest control. Um, Cats got good food, and eventually we started to figure out how to live together. Up until very recently, The best evidence of cat domestication came from Egypt, and really quite late. Um, at some point during the Bronze Age, which people had been storing grain and farming for a very long time before that. But really, only in the last decade, this the remains of this from this archaeological excavation in Cyprus um, were found less than 20 years ago. This is datable to about 10,000 BC, so the very early Neolithic. Um, oh, excuse me, 7,500 BC. 10,000 years before present. Excuse me, I was remembering a different notation. Um, and this pushes back our best evidence of feline companionship to humans by several thousand years. Um, so, just as a side note, this is the first time we've had human remains in the slides. I will, in general, put a little note down at the bottom of the slide that precedes any instance of human remains. So if this is something that you have, that you have a religious issue with, or a personal um, personal sensitivity to, you're warned and can take whatever steps you need to. So the incorporation of animals closely and consistently with human life, settled human life, is one of these hallmark changes of the Neolithic period. Interestingly, the Neolithic Revolution was not a steady or necessarily widespread thing. We find large periods of abandonment and poverty, villages that start, that um, that fail quickly. We find places where people started farming and seem to have given it up. We find, periods of poverty alongside periods of abundance, and this is a question that archaeologists have also been investigating. We think that in part there are climate stresses. The Neolithic was a period of um, fluctuations in the climate. Um, we also think that some of this has to do with population pressures, increases in population that put pressure on differences in human communities. And I'll talk about this a little bit with Çatalhöyük in Anatolia in a few minutes. We've already talked about some of the problems, some of the questions around environmental circumscription as a possible factor in the creation of states in the late Neolithic period, and also population increase. So, once again, if you want to think further about the climate, I recommend reading this table. I'm not going to just read it to you, but this compares the approximate dates of changes in the climate that we can see through historical climate data, and the cultures and phases of the Neolithic period at about the same time. And I recommend that you compare this to the table on slide 19 and think about what we're going to talk about in the next couple of lectures with these various cultures and how they relate to these paleo-environmental conditions. So there are before we look at specifics, I'm going to talk about some large-scale results of the Neolithic Revolution. And then I will, break these down and give you more vivid archaeological details after I've laid out the big picture here. So, changes in architecture and the technologies of tool and storage creation spread rapidly across parts of Western Asia and the Mediterranean during the Neolithic period. And alongside that, population density increased dramatically. from the Paleolithic. So somewhere between 10 and 50 times what it was during the Paleolithic period. The human diets altered radically away from meat and foraged vegetables to grains. And grains become a large part of human diets in Western Asia, the Mediterranean, the ancient Near East. Resulting from this increase in population density and people living sedentary lifestyles where they stay in one place, we see an explosion of diseases. Those parasites I spoke about earlier, dysentery, malaria, as well as an extreme growth of dental problems caused from increasing amounts of sugar, from carbohydrates that, cereals, grains becoming the major part of people's diets, and also grinding. When you stone grind grain, it causes tiny particles of stone and sand to get mixed in with the ground grain itself, and that extra grit in the major food source actually seems to have ground away at people's teeth and made them more susceptible to cavities. So the increase in sugars from carbs and grit from grinding made dental issues a huge part of the changes in people's health that we see in the Neolithic. We also, however, see the life expectancy for women go up. If you remember, in the Paleolithic period, it was the average age of death for women was about 30 years old. And some scholars think that less nomadism increased the chances of women getting, good physical recovery time after birth, which increased the birth rate. Agriculture increased the food supply, and these lead to postnatal adjustment, better healing, and interestingly, a gradual genetic adaptation to resist endemic infections. What we mean by endemic infections are these things that become entrenched in places and populations, and these are very often diseases that relate to human crowding, parasites, dysentery, malaria. And in fact, some of the genetic diseases that we see today, things like various heritable kinds of anemia in the Mediterranean, sickle cell disease, cystic fibrosis, in fact, may all result from some of these genetic adaptations to specific endemic infections. For inheritable anemia and sickle cell disease, those may be adaptations to malaria. Cystic fibrosis may be a genetic adaptation to tuberculosis that has had unexpected effects. We also see physical changes in human beings during the Neolithic. Height, length, bone length, other physical characteristics that we saw indicating widespread good health and nutrition in the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic actually decrease during the Neolithic. This is probably due to poor protein intake in childhood. It may very well have to do with a less balanced diet. So less, meat, vegetables, small amounts of grains, to, a full dependence on cereals as the major source of calories in the human diet. So Anthropologists also think of the Neolithic Revolution as the first epidemiological transition. This isn't just a revolution in how people, how people procure their food and how they live together physically. It's also, as you may have guessed already, a huge change in human health, and especially in disease. So the first epidemiological transition is during the Neolithic period. Um, Foraging cultures switch to agriculture. The increased population density leads to more people, but also more disease from intense sedentary human contact. The second transition happened about 200 years ago with the germ theory of disease, improved sanitation and living conditions, especially in cities. And these things eliminated many infectious diseases, leaving mostly chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease and cancer as major causes of death. Um, we don't hear of people dying of vitamin deficiencies very often anymore, or at least not in many places of things like cholera from tainted water. We are, however, now in the midst of what some medical anthropologists are calling the third epidemiological transition, which is right now. This is a period of emerging infectious diseases um, brought on by human intervention in the environment. So deforestation, climate change, um, large numbers of people with incredibly rapid travel compared to all of previous human history, has led to a host of new infectious diseases, H5N1, HIV/AIDS, Zika, Ebola, dengue fever, new and unfortunately sometimes antibiotic-resistant cholera, and the one that we are all so familiar with at this point, COVID-19. These seem to have come about based on the intense and rapid removal of um, climate of habitat for animals, which lead to closer contact between humans and animals who had not been in close contact with humans before, and opportunities for diseases that they carry to mutate and jump to humans. So, with all of these, with some of these downsides that we see to the transition to agriculture in the Neolithic period, we have to kind of ask, why farm? Um, this has been an ongoing question among anthropologists who study the Neolithic period, and has led to multiple different hypotheses about, why farming in this period came to be a more, what seemed to be a better choice for human subsistence than hunting and gathering, which had, really served humanity fairly well overall in the large scheme of things for hundreds of thousands of years before. Some of these theories include our friend V. Gordon Childe, who came up with the Neolithic Revolution, thought that um, he argued that nature had, just in general, has a relatively low carrying capacity in any given territory. That means that it means by carrying capacity is the number of human beings that a given territory can support. The limited amount of food, so the land can carry a limited number of human beings. But once farming was adopted, the availability of food becomes greater, so the carrying capacity is raised, and this leads to a population explosion. So essentially, more food first, then later then leads to population growth. Now, this is not the last word, of course. In the mid-1960s, an anthropologist, Dr. Esther Boserup, um, you know, argued for the opposite. She thought that, you really need a reason to start farming. And she hypothesized that it was, in fact, population growth first, that population growth itself um, encouraged the development of agriculture um, because people needed to use the land more intensively and adopt innovations to increase, the carrying capacity of a given territory. So Esther Boserup argued population first, and because of population growth, then development of ways to increase food. A third scholar, beginning in 1990, Brian Hayden, actually took a completely different approach. Rather than this, chicken and egg argument, food first, then population, population first, then food, Dr. Hayden really thought about this in a different way. He he argued that the technological innovations that began in the Neolithic period allowed for people who he termed individuals with accumulative personalities to, to gain surplus food, and then through redistribution to other people to gain power through followers, and that it was actually competition for followers, because you can give them feasts. Essentially, you can give food, you can throw parties. Competition between accumulative personalities who wanted people to, look up to them, and who gained followers by distributing resources. Um, this competition is what really encouraged the increase in resources. So you develop ways to increase your resources so that you can give away more food, hold better parties, hold more abundant parties, and therefore gain more followers. This is what really encouraged agricultural development, not drought or population pressure or starvation. This is really interesting. So we're going to talk about it a little more. So what was Hayden's evidence? He, kind of like Vere Gordon-Childe, Hayden looked at the development of agriculture in multiple parts of the world, unconnected archaeological contexts. And he reviewed all of this with the goal of trying to see what was similar about these unconnected developments of agriculture. His study included Japan, included the ancient Near East, it included the eastern woodlands of the US, and Mesoamerica. And the commonality between these cultures that he noticed were that most early plants and animals that were domesticated are often things associated with condiments, ways of making your food taste good, drinking or other euphoria-inducing plants, and prestige items. So some examples of this include gourds, chili peppers, avocados, and dogs. Dogs as prestige animals and hunting companions to help you get more meat for a feast. Avocados, condiments. I mean, guacamole is delicious. Chili peppers. The capsaicin in chili peppers leads to, if you eat enough of it, will release endorphins and make you feel, real good. And then gourds are especially useful for as beverage containers, probably for fermentation. And these are the first domesticated plants and animals in these situations, rather than bulk subsistence items. So rather than grains, rather than sheep and goats. So none of these are necessarily native to the ancient Near East. Dogs come with people much earlier. Gourds can be found in Africa. Um, Chili peppers and avocados are both New World foods. What do we find when we look at the ancient Near East? So any grain or fruit that has sugar in it can ferment. So following on from Hayden's hypothesis here, we may owe agriculture in the ancient Near East to alcohol. I want to warn you all that this is not something that is a done deal. We cannot just blanket say, oh yes, beer is the cause of agriculture. However, we do have some interesting and compelling evidence. In particular, and this is not the only archaeological evidence of alcohol making in the right at the edge of the early right at the early edge of the Neolithic in the Levant, but at a burial site, the culture of the Neolithic in the Levant is often called the Natufian culture, and I will talk about them more in a bit. So at this burial site called Rakafet Cave, near Mount Carmel, on the Mediterranean, near the Mediterranean coast of the Levant, archaeologists in the late 1990s and early 2000s found strong evidence of deliberate beer brewing at this burial site, which also had the remains of other rituals. There's a large amount of cooked animal bone found, suggesting feasts. And there are these holes hollowed out of the bedrock. This is, you can see, as they were found, and then this is from the top. There are also some freestanding, essentially hollowed out boulders, and these seem to have been used as mortars for cracking grains. And they also seem to have been used to ferment mixtures of grain and water. Um, how do we know this? So by dissolving small amounts of the residue left in the bottoms and sides of stone and ceramic. No ceramic from this level here, but this is a thing that can also be done with ceramics. By dissolving some of the residue and then using different kinds of isotopic analysis that I talked about earlier, and by simply taking microscopic photos of the residual materials from these vessels, we can see some key signs of fermentation. So here, this is a microscopic photo of modern starches that have been through fermentation. This is some of the leftovers of brewing beer, and you can see here, so each one of these ovals is a grain of starch. You can see this one here especially has this collapse, this area where it looks like the starch granule has collapsed. This one also here. And here it's not as obvious, but it's very common for this collapse to occur in an X pattern, a rough X. And we can see on the right here, these are this compares modern fermented starches to the residue of starches from these mortars up here, and there are further photos taken from these pits in the limestone bedrock down here, and they too show this characteristic structural collapse in these starch grains that is a key sign of fermentation. So alongside the barbecue at these funerals, at this very, very early Neolithic site in Israel, we also see people ingesting alcohol. Now, this is probably not nearly as strong as modern fermented drinks. It was probably also not necessarily just liquid. This was probably closer to porridge in texture than, modern beer. However, it would still have a psychoactive effect. So there is a case to be made for, owing agriculture, in fact, to so this period where we see this first evidence of fermentation is part of what is often called the pre-pottery Neolithic. Um, it's often it's often abbreviated PPN. We'll talk about the earlier PPNA, the pre-pottery Neolithic Part A, and pre-pottery Neolithic Part B. And this is the period of this long, slow shift to sustained agriculture and animal husbandry. And throughout this period, people are also still hunting and gathering, even when they are in sedentary living situations. We start to see more permanent architecture, permanent settlements, monumental architecture, and the beginnings of dedicated ritual and public spaces. So people are using their space differently, and they are setting it up in different ways than what we have seen before in hunter-gatherer societies, even in instances like those mammoth bone structures from Eastern Europe that seem to have been, at least some of them, seasonal gathering places rather than permanent settlements. We see increasing evidence of long-distance trade between communities. Long-distance trade happened in the Paleolithic, but it becomes ever more prevalent during the Neolithic period. We see the development of new artistic mediums and materials, textiles, plaster. We will see plaster becoming very important. We see a just wide array of practices of ritual and practices of burial. And by the end of PPNB, so around 6,500, sometime between 7,000 and 6,000 BC, depending on where you're looking at,